So the goal today is to talk about feature changes, formal feature changes of verbal derivational morphemes. So how do morphosyntactic properties or formal features of derivational morphemes change, and why is this syntactic change? So why do I feel that this is an appropriate topic for a diachronic generative syntax rather than morphology conference? And this has to do with broader questions such as how, in general, do new categorizers arise diachronically. So today I want to talk about some theoretical preliminaries for studying change in derivational and categorizing morphology, specifically in relation to syntactic cycles and upwards reanalysis in derivational morphology. And I want to propose two very broad diachronic trajectories in the development of verbalizers, namely from denominal verbs to unergative verbalizers and from deadjectival verbs to inchoative and accusative verbalizers. And we're going to look at three very preliminary case studies from older Indo-European languages, two that illustrate the first development from denominal to unergative, that's case study 1 and 3. And one that illustrates, I think, the second development from deadjectival to inchoative. And these studies are mostly from Greek and other older Indo-European languages, but importantly, they're all from languages with very rich fusional synthetic verbal systems. And then we'll conclude with some generalizing remarks on formalization of verbal stem forming morphology in synchrony and diachrony. So in syntax, there's of course a very rich research tradition that talks about syntactic change as cyclic change in generative diachronic syntax, but also in other approaches. And there are some very well-known and well-studied examples that include the subject and object agreement cycle, the negation cycle, and so on. And in these approaches, the cyclic nature of syntactic change is thought to be due to general economy principles. I'm citing here the ones proposed by Eli van Gelderen in a lot of work, but of course there are other formulations. Van Gelderen proposes the head preference principle, be a head rather than a phrase. That one's not going to be important for us today, but the second one, the late merge principle, is the one that I think underlies many of these changes in derivational morphology that we see in the older Indo-European languages. And that says merge as late as possible. So this, if you will, is a type of upwards reanalysis that has been discussed throughout the literature by Robertson Busso, for example, and Cornan 2014 and other work, where basically the generalization is that material in lower projections is reanalyzed as space generated in higher projection. And this can take the form of lexical verbs, for example, becoming reanalyzed in functional projections in the TP domain. So 2 gives you just an example of the modal cycle where lexical verbs in the VP are reanalyzed upwards into the TP and end up as modal auxiliaries. So rather than merging low and then moving, the LMP or upwards reanalysis or similar principles say you just merge higher and save yourself the additional step. And these approaches are based on fairly standard definitions of reanalysis, where reanalysis is simply a mechanism where a given surface string in an acquirer's grammar receives a different representation, a different parse than in the input grammar. A fairly standard definition, I think. So the cause of these types of reanalysis, of upwards reanalysis, is a combination of L1 acquisition mechanisms and third factor principles. So given ambiguous input, acquirers would choose a derivation that requires as few steps as possible. So instances of movement or formal features or whatever those steps may be. And these, and of course, there are similar principles that have been proposed in the literature. And in general, these economy-driven syntactic cycles cover many instances of change that are traditionally described as grammaticalization in the sort of more functionalist oriented literature, where we have, for example, second compound members turning into suffixes, clitics turning into affixes, and so on, lexical verbs into functional verbs. But there's very little work about changes in lexical categories themselves, so in derivational morphemes themselves that don't fit into these traditional grammaticalization studies or cycles. And I think in lexicalist approaches, this isn't too surprising, because when you assume that word formation happens in the lexicon, or at any rate it happens before syntax happens, there's really no reason why you would expect word formation changes to mirror syntactic changes. But in non-lexicalist realizational approaches like distributed morphology, which I'm using, or also in nanosyntax, or exoskeletal approaches, I think there's actually a really strong prediction that diachronic reanalysis, such as upwards reanalysis or the LMP, should in principle apply to morphological changes and syntactic changes equally. There shouldn't really be a difference between the change within a word and sort of at the word level, like we saw for the modal cycle. So the goal of this talk is to convince you that we can actually study these changes in derivational and categorizing morphology in pretty much the same way we study other instances of cyclic syntactic change, and that this may actually give us interesting generalizations and predictions about argument structure change. And I was very happy to see that there were some talks at DIGS already that go in the same direction. There was one on Wednesday, and also the one on archaic Chinese this morning. So I hope that this fits into a sort of broader program of a research program. Okay, so just a quick rerun of how verbal morphology works in DM. In DM, we assume full decomposition of complex words. The mirror principle, so the order of morphemes in a complex verb, is expected to mirror a syntactic structure, the sequence of functional projections along the verbal spine. And synthetic verbs are complex heads that are built by cyclic head movement, successive cyclic head movement, as illustrated in 3 with a fairly complex Latin form that I took from EMBIC 2000, where we assume that the roots combine with verbal stem forming morphemes, and then with higher functional verbal projections, and terminal nodes get spelled out or realized with designated morphemes depending on their feature content and on the context. So the question now is, what are these things exactly? Where do these little v's and so on come from diachronically? So in DM, words are not stored in the lexicon. Categories aren't stored in the lexicon. They are created in the syntax via merge by combining a root with a categorizing head. In English, you don't necessarily always see these heads overtly, but they're there. And now the question is, where do these categorizing heads come from? And specifically, where do verbalizers, such as this little v here, come from diachronically? And as I said, there's a little bit of literature on turning lexemes, if you want, to nouns, for example, in compounds into suffixes, like in these Italian and German examples. But there's less work on verbalizers, and especially there's even less work on verbalizers where nothing grammaticalizes, so where you get suffixes just turning into other suffixes without any sort of change along the grammaticalization climb. So answering this question, I think, might actually give us insight into argument structure changes more generally, and argument structure cycles. In DM, verbal stem forming morphology is usually identified with the verbalizer little v, which can have different features or flavors. Some of these are listed here, and we may be able to conflate some of these. So little v cause and little v become may turn out to be the same thing. There's something usually that gives you a state. And there's little v do that you find in unergatives. And like other categorizers, these are thought to mediate between the root and higher functional projections. And then argument and event structure alternations, such as the causative alternation and passivization, are actually thought to be due to the interaction of little v and voice, where voice is the projection that introduces the external argument, or depending on its features, induces passivization and things like that. So this is based on the approach by Alexiado, Anagnospoulou, and Schäfer and others that we already saw in Lieven Dankert's talk as well. So in mainstream generative approaches to argument structure, there's another idea of how this relates, how verbalizing morphology relates to argument structure, going back to a very influential proposal by Hale and Kaiser, which says that unergative verbs are essentially denominal verbs. So unergative, intransitive verbs are verbs where a noun incorporates into a selecting verbal projection, will be do. And the evidence for this comes from light verb construction, precisely with such a light verb do in Basque and Tanoan and Yaqui and many other languages. So in these languages, to sleep is basically sleep do, and to laugh is laugh do, and so on. So you do actually see the verbalizer overtly is the idea here. And the same for certain unaccusative change of state verbs, namely those associated with the causative alternation. So some of these are thought to be diachronic verbs where an adjective incorporates into or conflates with little v become projection. And again, the evidence comes from change of state verbs that are morphologically related to property concept adjectives in a variety of languages. So this slide just summarizes this structure of unergative versus unaccusative verbs that has been proposed. So unergative verbs, again, take a noun that incorporates into the selecting little v do projection, and then the external argument is introduced by voice, while unaccusative and coative verbs are formed by an adjective incorporating into a selecting little v become projection. And then if you want to make this transitive causative, you can still add voice and add an external argument. And I think from this approach, there are some interesting diachronic predictions that follow from this approach that haven't really been explored very much. And these are that now in languages that have rich synthetic derivational morphology and overt verbalizing morphology, unlike English, we actually expect synthetic unergatives to be formed either with verbalizers that are historically related to light verbs like do, like we just saw in Basque and Tanoan, or with verbalizers that are historically related to nominal morphology. And this follows if we take this approach seriously and say, okay, an unergative is really a noun that has incorporated into something higher. So then we actually expect some remnants of nominal morphology to surface occasionally. And the same for unaccusative change of state verbs. This should be formed either with verbalizers that are historically related to light verbs like become, or with verbalizers that are related to adjectival derivational morphology, again, because we're assuming that the adjective incorporates into the selecting projection. And so the first option is reasonably well studied in both cases, because this is, as we said, part of this very rich grammaticalization literature, where you get light verbs that become suffixes, though it tends to be tense aspect mood morphology rather than verbalizing morphology. But there isn't really that much research on option 2. I think that's a little bit understudied. So this is the topic of my upcoming project on verbal categories and categorizers in diachrony, funded by the Austrian Science Fund and hopefully starting this summer. In DM and similar approaches, we do actually expect the same mechanism that gives rise to the reanalysis of lexical verbs as auxiliaries, like in the modal cycle, for example, to also apply to the reanalysis of synthetic morphology, of derivational morphology, because the difference between these is epiphenomenal in DM. There's no strong sense in which the word level is special or important. So we expect to see, I think, the following cycles of derivational morphology in the diachrony of these languages. We expect to see verbalizers arising from nominalizers in the context of the nominal verbs, unergative verbs. We expect verbalizers to arise from adjectival morphology in the adjectival verbs. And we also expect the verbalizers themselves to be reanalyzed as higher functional suffixes, so a morphology relating to voice and aspect. So now we can go to the case studies very briefly and look at some of the evidence for this. The first case study treats ancient Greek verbs in ewo. So these were originally derived from nouns of professions or ancient nouns formed with the suffix eos, so Basileus king. And from this, you could make a verb be king, Basileo, by using this verbalizer yeo. The ye then gets lost through sound change. So these originally form intransitive states, intransitive stative verbs. So be king among you with a locatival dative, or of you with the genitive. But already in Homer, we already find one of these ewo verbs that is transitive with an accusative object. And already at the early stage in Homer, we also find several of these ewo verbs that have derivational bases that don't contain nominal ewos. So we find achewo to be in command, or to be a commander, from achos, and hegemonewo from hegemon, and so on, where there isn't any sort of nominal eo in the base. And on the way to modern Greek, this originally nominal suffix was apparently completely reanalyzed as a verbalizer as part of the verbal domain. It's a productive verbalizer in modern Greek, where it selects nouns, adjectives, and adverbs, and is used to nativize loanwords, as in 11. And this is discussed in detail in this very nice article that's cited here, Panayotidis et al. 2017, where they show that this evo F in modern Greek synchronically is just another verbalizer, and there's no F in the base here. So this looks like one of these cases of upwards reanalysis that I'm looking for, where something nominal in the context of the nominal verbs is reanalyzed as part of the verbal domain. So this eo here has been reanalyzed as a little v marker, essentially. There's some phonology going on here that we can talk about if you're interested. But crucially, this same type of upwards reanalysis apparently gave rise to a number of other modern Greek verbalizers that are very productive and that are also discussed by Panayotidis et al. The second case study shows, I think, the development of an inchoative verbal stem forming suffix from the adjectival verbs. So this is this mysterious verbal stem forming suffix e that almost all older branches of Indo-European have, but which has a very strange distribution. It forms both the nominal and primary verbal presence, or aorist, so it's not restricted to a particular stem type across languages, and that's very unusual for an Indo-European verbal stem forming suffix. It forms present or imperfective stems in Anatolian, Italic, and Germanic. It forms the adjectival verbs in some of these, and primary underived verbs apparently also. And it's associated with the aorist or perfective stem in Greek and Balto-Slavic. So it's found in the famous passive aorist in Greek, which, if you look at the examples, you can already see isn't really passive. And it's found in primary verbs in Old Church Slavonic, but also in the adjectival verbs in both Baltic and Slavic. In Latin, this is part of a subclass of second conjugation stative verbs, stative presents actually, which have long been known to be associated with the adjectival verb formation in a synchronic alternation with first conjugation factative verbs and with inchoative verbs in escere, where we have the same e. So clear, to be clear, clarere, to become clear, and to make clear. So here it's very clearly associated with the adjectival morphology. And in Greek, this is, as we said, found in the so-called passive aorist. This is actually a misnomer, at least at the earliest stage, because the suffix and its variant te, this gives you the modern Greek perfective passive marker. But in ancient Greek, these two are still sort of stative inchoative verbal stem forming suffixes rather than voice markers, as in the examples in 16 here. So erue flowed, epage became fixed, and emane went mad aren't really passives. So originally this seems to have expressed lexical aspect or Aktionsart rather than voice. And then the development into a voice marker seems to have started gradually on the way to classical Greek. So this slide I'm going to skip. This just summarizes the arguments that this is really a little v rather than voice. One of the arguments is actually that it's found in complementary distribution with other verbal stem forming morphology and not in complementary distribution with voice morphology, as you can see here. So this alternates with the transitive active present marker and the aorist marker rather than with a voice marker. So I've suggested before that this really means we should analyze this A and its variant T as a verbalizer that combines with a perfective aspect projection and then other higher functional projections. And if we assume this structure, we actually also get the obligatory active morphology on the endings here for free by using this particular spell-out condition that I won't go into here in detail now. So where does this A come from? This is what's interesting to us now. So there's this proposal in the literature that this was actually originally a nominal suffix that originated in adjectival abstract nouns. So abstracts from property concept adjectives such as red, fixed, dry, and so on. And that this is actually the original instrumental inflectional suffix of these adjectival abstract nouns that became reanalyzed in analytic constructions that we still see in Vedic Sanskrit, and Latin also has some remnants of that. So are facio also has facit are, where you can still see that this long A thing could still be used in Tmisis. And this suggests that this was originally a nominal suffix. It was actually a nominal inflectional suffix, so not quite an adjectivizer, but it was reanalyzed in the context of the adjectival derivation, I think, and then became first a stative and then an inchoative verbal stem forming suffix. So again, this seems to be an instance of upwards reanalysis. So this long A instrumental marker was reanalyzed from the adjectival or nominal domain, if you want, into the verbal domain, and then also became reanalyzed even higher if we accept that this eventually became a voice marker on the way to modern Greek. But the analysis of the modern Greek reflex is also a little bit contested. But then we could say, okay, this has been reanalyzed from nominalizer to verbalizer to either voice or aspect. Okay, and I think I have a couple of minutes to go into the third case study. So this is based on joint work with Dalina Kaluli at the University of Vienna. This is a project where we have looked at standard German verbal diminutives with an umlauting suffix L that acts as a deadjectival, deverbal, and denominal verbalizer in modern standard German. So we can form diminutive verbs from adjectives, so weak to act weak, from verbs, so kochen, köcheln, so boil to simmer, so to boil slightly if you want, and then frost, frösteln, to frost, basically to shiver or be cold. And this is fairly productive. We've shown that these classes, at least, there are a lot of these verbs, but at least these three classes are mostly anergative activity verbs according to standard tests. You can see this very clearly with the deverbal ones that differ in argument structure from the supposed base verb. So for example, if the base verb is transitive, then very often the derived diminutive cannot take a direct object, although there's a lot of speaker variation here. So this really seems like a way of making anergative iterative activity verbs. And of course, we find the same suffix in nominal diminutives. In standard German, this is actually very lexicalized, but you can also see the umlaut here. So Busch, Büschel, small bunch or tuft, Bund, Bündel, and so on. And there's a non-umlauting variant in Austro-Bavarian dialects in Viennese, for example, that's fully productive. So Sack, Sackerl, Suppe, Suppel, and so on. This suffix goes back to an Old High German suffix that formed diminutives from nouns and also instrument nouns from verbs, and triggers umlaut of a preceding vowel. There's also a non-umlauting variant, and this in turn goes back to a Proto-Indo-European primary adjective forming suffix. So this is a really old suffix. There are some examples here for diminutives and instrument nouns derived from different bases. And then already in Old High German and many other related Germanic languages, we find denominal and deadjectival verbs from such nouns and adjectives in il and ol. So this is an old derivational process. This stays productive throughout the history of German. So both diminutives and instrument nouns can and do become the basis for these denominal verbs throughout the history. This slide, I think I'm also going to have to skip. This basically, there's also an old verbal suffix an old suffix that's described as purely verbal iterative, but I think this can ultimately be reduced to the same thing. So we don't have to go into that now, but we can come back to it if there's still time. And so basically what we proposed in this paper is that sort of transparent denominal verbs from marked diminutives in L, so Bündel, for example, became reanalyzed as verbalizer L in the verbal domain. So this diminutive suffix basically became reanalyzed as a verbalizer in the context of these originally transparently denominal verbs. And what's interesting is that this particular type of denominal derivation actually gives rise to a very particular type of verbalizing semantics, verbalizing morphology, namely iterative unergative verbs. And we think that this has something to do with the semantics of the nominal diminutivizer, which creates countable units, which is basically an individuation marker. And reanalyzed in the context of the verbal domain, this gives you pluractionality in the sense of Tovena 2010, and you end up with these iterative verbs. So this is really nice because it shows us that diminutive verbs are a subtype of the nominal to unergative reanalysis, and then depending on what kind of nominal you reanalyze into the verbal domain, you actually get different types of verbal semantics from that. Okay, so to conclude, I hope I'm not too much over time. So these case studies suggest that there are really regularities in the change of verbal derivational morphology that give rise to new verbalizers. We've seen some of these examples for the reanalysis of nominalizer to verbalizer and different types of denominal verbs giving rise to different types of unergatives. You can also see this in the in participial morphology, so in other aspects that I haven't really talked about now, and there are some typological parallels for these kinds of reanalysis that are also discussed in the literature, and especially in the old Indo-European languages, there are some that you just keep seeing over and over again, like the reanalysis of incoative to passive, or of possessive denominal adjectives to the verbal adjectives, and so on. So I think this type of generalization of morphosyntactic features of these formations makes it possible for us to identify regularities of diachronic developments in the derivational morphological domain through reanalysis, even for developments that don't display traditional grammaticalization characteristics. So the next steps are obviously to extend the empirical groundwork for this work to create a morphosyntactically annotated database of denominal and deadjectival verbs in Indo-European languages, to increase the number of case studies and to look more closely at how valency alternations arise in these contexts and what the role of phonology is. Okay, thank you very much. And I'll close here.